The first sound Esther heard was the cry of a gull out on the harbor. It carried through the cracks of the quarter's thin boards, sharper than the winter air that crept into her bones. She opened her eyes slowly, her body still heavy from the labor of yesterday, her hands stiff with the ache of kneading, chopping, lifting pots too large for one woman to carry. At 42, she had known little else but the rhythm of kitchens and the endless demands of the Thornhill household. The small room smelled of damp wood and ash from the fire that had long gone cold. Ida lay beside her, curled tight, face turned to the wall. The girl had been crying in her sleep again. Esther reached a hand out, almost brushing the thin shoulder, then pulled it back. Comfort was a fragile thing in this place. Words did not stop the lash or the sail. Silence was the only protection they had left. She pushed herself up, wrapped her scarf tight around her head, and stood in the half-dark. The floorboards creaked under her bare feet as she dressed quickly, careful not to wake the girl. She knew the welts on Ida's back were fresh, purple ridges from yesterday's punishment. The sound of the glass shattering, Caroline's shriek, Thornhill's leather whip cutting down without pause, it all played again in Esther's mind. She carried those echoes with her, stacked one upon another like the stones that lined the drive to the house, heavy and immovable. Outside, the air bit against her skin, but the scent of salt and wood smoke reminded her where she was. The mansion loomed over the harbor, white columns rising like teeth in the dawn light, each one bought with suffering. Ships still came and went, carrying spices from distant waters, fruits wrapped in straw, barrels of molasses. She touched them all in the kitchen. Her hands transformed them into feasts praised across Charleston, yet no one ever asked her name. They only praised Thornhill, the generous host, the man of taste and refinement, never the woman who made the flavors bloom. Inside, the kitchen already held the chill of stone walls. Esther lit the fire, coaxing sparks from kindling until the flames caught and began to lick the iron stove. This room, at least, belonged to her. Here she knew every pot, every knife, every rhythm of heat and timing. Here she could command the younger helpers without fear of their defiance, for they trusted her to keep them safe when she could. But even here shadows stretched long. Caroline's footsteps came often, and Thornhill's sudden entrances bent the air with dread. She reached for the eggs, set the pan just so, prepared the ham in slices no thicker than the mistress's taste would allow. She moved with practiced care, each step part of a dance learned over nearly 3 decades. When the tray was ready, coffee steaming, biscuits golden, eggs pale and soft, she placed the silver carefully, her hand steady though her chest felt hollow. She thought of the bandage on her arm beneath the sleeve, hidden from sight. The burn from last week's thrown cup still throbbed when she moved too quickly. She carried the scar as she carried all the others, silent marks no one else cared to see. The mansion above her stirred awake. Servants' steps pattered across polished floors. Caroline's voice rang sharp, ordering, correcting, finding fault. Esther kept her eyes low when the mistress appeared at the doorway, dressed in silk even before breakfast. The woman's gaze swept the kitchen as though she smelled something spoiled, though it was only Esther and her helpers moving quietly in the warmth of the fire. Caroline's words cut, but Esther's reply came smooth, polite, without tremor. She had learned long ago that her tone could be as dangerous as any knife if it slipped. When the mistress left, silence returned. Only the sound of chopping filled the air. Esther worked the pestle against the mortar, crushing herbs for the day's dishes. Each strike echoed like a heartbeat, steady, relentless. The scent of thyme and sage rose around her, mingling with the smoke, wrapping her in the only comfort she allowed herself. Yet her mind strayed where she tried not to let it wander, back to the children she had once taught to name these herbs, the small fingers that had plucked leaves from the garden with her. James at 7, Sarah at 10. Both gone, sold away, as easily discarded as spoiled bread. She paused, pressing her hands flat against the table until the tremor passed. Then she moved again, more quickly, her motions precise. She had no room for error, not in this house, not with Caroline's eyes, not with Thornhill's temper. She stirred the stew pot for the slaves' dinner later, simple broth with scraps of meat, nothing like the banquet she prepared for the master's guests. She thought of the Christmas ball already being planned, 3 weeks away, a night when all Charleston's wealth and power would gather under these chandeliers to eat her food, drink her punch, laugh in rooms lit by her labor. Esther wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the room to the far corner. Her eyes lingered on the floorboard near her pallet upstairs, the one that shifted if you pressed it just right. Beneath it lay the small box she had kept for years, its contents a secret talisman she had never dared to use. She did not take it out, not yet. But the thought of it, the knowledge that such a choice lay within reach, was enough to steady her breath. She returned to the fire, lifted the pot, and tasted the broth. Too thin, she thought, adding a pinch more salt. Outside the sun rose higher, painting the harbor gold. Inside, the house roared to life above her, the day beginning as it always did, with her unseen, her hands feeding those who would never know her hunger. She lowered her eyes, set her shoulders, and continued to cook. The news came without warning, spoken plain as though it carried no weight. Thornhill mentioned it over supper, a careless remark about debts and auctions, his mouth full of roast duck Esther had prepared only hours before. Lucy, barely 13, was to be sold at the market in 2 days. Caroline nodded without protest, her jeweled hand resting lightly on the table as if the girl were no more than a chair to be moved from one room to another. Esther stood in the shadows of the dining room, pouring wine, her face calm though her blood throbbed against her skin. Later, when the silver had been cleared and the fire burned low, she found Ida in the quarters, rocking on the edge of the cot, arms wrapped around herself. Her body shook as though from cold though the air was heavy with heat. Esther touched her shoulder and felt the tremor run through her. Ida's lips formed Lucy's name again and again, no sound but breath, like a prayer already broken. Esther wanted to say she understood, that she too had seen her children vanish through the same gate, but the words stuck in her throat. She sat beside her, hand resting light against the girl's back, waiting for the storm of tears to pass. Jeremiah came at dawn, his steps uneven, his frame bent, but still strong enough to carry water buckets from the well. He spoke low as they walked, the words meant only for her ears. Thornhill planned to sell him, too, before spring. The man was old, and his value had dropped. Thornhill saw him as nothing but wasted coin. Jeremiah's eyes were tired but steady, holding no fear, only a dull knowing. He had lived long enough to see such things repeated countless times. Still, he reached out, squeezed Esther's hand, whispered that she must guard her heart, though she could not imagine how. In the kitchen the next day, the tension pressed like heat from the fire. Esther worked in silence, her mind replaying every word, every cry from Ida's room, every sharp laugh from Thornhill when he spoke of debts. She remembered the time he had teased Caroline about replacing Esther with a younger cook, some girl trained up fresh who would cost him nothing. He had said it with a smirk, not caring that Esther stood close enough to hear. She had kept her face smooth, her hands steady, though inside her chest the thought burned like coal. If she were sold, it would be the end of her, body too worn to fetch much price, spirit too tired to begin again in some other man's house. That night, the quarters carried no sound but the scratching of rats in the walls. Esther lay awake, eyes fixed on the dark, while Ida sobbed beside her, muffling her face in the thin pillow. She thought of Lucy's small hands, remembered her laughter in the garden, how she used to pluck mint leaves and press them to her tongue. The thought of her being led away, of her body marked with numbers, of her future bent into silence, filled Esther with a rage so deep it frightened her. For years she had buried such fire, pressing it down each time it rose, telling herself survival required stillness. But the weight of it now threatened to split her apart. When the day of the sale arrived, the sky was low and gray. Esther watched from the far end of the yard as Lucy was pulled toward the cart, her wrists bound, her dress hanging loose against her thin frame. The girl did not cry out. She stared straight ahead, jaw set, eyes wide and dry, though Ida's wail cut through the air like a blade. Esther held her back, arms tight around the girl's waist, whispering against her ear to hush, to breathe, to stay alive. Thornhill barely glanced their way. He climbed into the carriage beside his wife, humming a tune as if nothing more serious than a business trip awaited him. That evening, the quarters lay in silence. No one spoke of Lucy, though every heart beat heavy with her absence. Ida sat curled against the wall, rocking as she had before, her body folded in on itself. Esther stared at the fire until the flames blurred, her thoughts circling without rest. She remembered James's small hand slipping from hers at the auction years ago, Sarah's scream when the man dragged her away. She had carried that sound in her chest all these years, a wound that never closed. Now Ida carried the same wound, and Esther could not bear to see it deepen. She walked outside, the night air sharp against her face. The harbor lights flickered in the distance, ships swaying gentle against the tide. Somewhere out there, others had found ways to run, to carve out lives beyond chains. She wondered what it would take, what she must risk, for Ida to have such a chance. Her eyes turned back to the mansion, windows glowing warm with candlelight, laughter echoing faint through the walls. Inside, Thornhill and Caroline lived untouched, their joy rising from the ruin of others. Esther clenched her hands until her nails bit her palms. The powder hidden beneath the floorboards stirred in her mind, a shadow waiting to be called forth. For years she had told herself it was only a relic, a memory of the Root Woman's warning, a piece of old magic better left alone. But now she felt its weight as if it were already in her pocket, its promise whispering louder each time she remembered Lucy's small face, Jeremiah's weary eyes, Ida's muffled sobs. The fire inside her no longer dulled with silence. It sharpened. Something had shifted, something that could not be pressed down again. She knew the line she stood upon, the choice waiting at her feet. Her breath slowed, her body steady, the thought taking shape with frightening clarity. She had endured nearly 3 decades in this house, but endurance had reached its end. The breaking had come, and from its pieces she would shape something Thornhill could never imagine. Winter pressed hard against the mansion, the cold slipping through cracks in stone and wood, seeping into bones that never found enough warmth. Esther worked close to the fire, sleeves rolled back, breath rising in faint clouds as she stirred pots heavy with broth. Jeremiah came slow that morning, his steps dragging more than usual, the weight of his years pulling his shoulders low. She offered him a cup of water sweetened with a little honey, but he only smiled, eyes tired, hands shaking as he took it. Later, word spread that Thornhill had caught him near the storeroom, a half-empty jug of bourbon clutched in his hands. Jeremiah had sworn it was for his aching joints, not theft, but Thornhill's anger needed no reason. Esther heard the shouting before she saw it. By the time she reached the yard, the overseer Parsons already had Jeremiah bent over the rail, his shirt torn open, Thornhill's whip lashing with cruel rhythm. Each crack split the air like lightning, each groan from Jeremiah sinking deep into Esther's chest. She wanted to turn away but could not. The man had been like a brother, a steady voice when storms raged, and now he was being torn apart before her eyes. When at last Thornhill tired, he threw the whip aside, muttering about worthless hands and wasted coin. Jeremiah crumpled, blood soaking the dirt, breath shallow. Parsons dragged him to the shed like a broken tool. Esther waited until the yard cleared, then slipped inside with rags and herbs tucked in her apron. She knelt beside him, pressing honey and crushed leaves into the torn flesh, whispering prayers she barely believed in. His eyes fluttered open long enough to find hers, a faint smile passing across his cracked lips. He told her not to waste herself on an old man, that her strength was needed for the young. Then his head fell heavy against her arm. She stayed with him through the night, feeding him sips of broth, singing low to keep him tethered. The fever came quick, sweat pouring from his skin, the smell of infection thick in the air. Esther begged Caroline for medicine, but the mistress waved her hand, saying no tonic should be wasted on a thieving slave. She walked away in silks, leaving Esther with rage burning so sharp it made her hands tremble. By morning, Jeremiah's breath had slowed to a faint rattle. He reached for her hand, his grip weak but steady, and whispered her name. She bent close, her tears falling into his hair as he told her to remember she was more than chains, more than this place. Then his chest rose one last time and stilled. The silence that followed felt heavier than stone. They buried him in the strip of land beyond the quarters. No marker but a rough stone, Esther said at the head. The others gathered quiet, their eyes lowered, their grief swallowed for fear of punishment. Esther stood apart, her hands clenched tight, the salt of her tears mixing with the taste of smoke. She wanted to scream, to tear the sky open with the weight of it, but instead she pressed her palm to the stone and promised him she would not forget. That night she returned to the kitchen, the fire long dim, shadows stretching across the walls. She moved to the far corner, lifted the loose brick, and pulled out the tin hidden beneath. The powder sat inside, pale and fine, a whisper of death resting silent all these years. She held it in her hand, feeling its weight though it was light as dust. The Root woman's words returned to her, warning of its power, its certainty. Esther had kept it close but unused, telling herself survival was all she needed. Now, with Jeremiah gone, she felt something shift deep inside. She crushed herbs slowly, carefully, the sound of the pestles striking the mortar steady like a drum. Each strike echoed in her chest, each scent rising around her like smoke from a hidden fire. She tested the powder on the edge of her finger, bitter against her tongue, dangerous and strong. She thought of Thornhill's laugh, of Caroline's jeweled hand waving away medicine, of Parsons dragging Jeremiah's body like a sack of grain. The rage inside her no longer pressed down. It rose clear, sharp as glass. In the days that followed, she moved with quiet purpose, her face as calm as ever, her hands steady at the stove. But inside she carried a new certainty. Every sound of Thornhill's boots on the stairs, every shrill command from Caroline, every crack of Parsons' whip now fell against a mind that had already chosen its path. She began to measure and weigh in silence, considering which dishes carried flavors strong enough to mask bitterness, which cups could hold more than wine. The others saw only the same woman they had always known, the cook who never raised her voice, who guided the kitchen with sure hands. They did not see the fire beneath her calm, or the powder hidden close, waiting for its moment. Esther carried her secret as she carried her grief, close against her chest, shaping it into something stronger than sorrow. She touched the stone at Jeremiah's grave each evening, whispering her promise again, letting the words root deep inside her. His death had not been in vain, not if she could make this house feel even a fraction of the pain it had given. She walked back to the quarters each night with her head high, Ida at her side, the weight of choice already resting steady in her heart. Jeremiah was gone, but his words lived in her still. And with them grew the certainty that she would act, not in haste, not in blind fury, but with the patience of a cook who knew the value of timing. The days leading to Christmas drew the mansion into a frenzy. Servants hurried from room to room, polishing silver until it gleamed, hanging garlands of pine, scrubbing marble floors until their hands bled. Thornhill strutted through the halls with his chest puffed wide, speaking of the ball as though it were to crown him king of Charleston. Caroline fluttered behind him, her voice sharp, ordering new linens, new candles, demanding that nothing less than perfection be offered to the governor and his circle. Esther heard it all from her place in the kitchen, each order falling on her shoulders as surely as the weight of the iron pots. The kitchen became a storm of fire and smoke, the air thick with spice and fat. Esther worked without pause, commanding the young ones with quick gestures, her voice calm though her mind burned. Every tray, every pot, every dish passed through her hands. Thornhill liked to boast that no house in Charleston could match the feasts of Thornhill Mansion. He did not see that the glory belonged not to him, but to the woman who bent her back over every flame. Esther moved through it like a shadow, unseen though her work touched every corner of the celebration. At night, when the others slept, she returned to the tin hidden beneath the brick. She poured the powder into her palm, watching how it caught the faint firelight. She began to measure, scraping the dust into small piles, dividing, testing. A rat found near the well became her first subject. She mixed a crumb of bread with a pinch and left it in the corner. By morning the rat lay stiff, its teeth bared in a frozen snarl. She buried it beneath the ash heap and made note of the strength. The next day she tested again, a smaller pinch, enough to sicken but not kill. She watched the twitching body, the slow fading of breath, until she understood the doses with certainty. She turned her thoughts to the menu for the ball. Thornhill had demanded roasted goose, oyster stew, beef tongue with Madeira sauce, sweet puddings, candied fruit, and a great bowl of rum punch spiced heavy for warmth. Esther pictured each dish, weighed each flavor in her mind. She knew where bitterness could hide, where the powder might melt into sweetness. She saw Thornhill lifting his glass of punch, Parsons reaching for his second helping of beef, Caroline praising the goose to her guests, all of them blind to the hand that had shaped their fate. One afternoon, Caroline came into the kitchen with a pale woman at her side, Miss Sinclair, a guest known for her weak stomach. Caroline instructed that a separate dish be made for her, plain chicken with no seasoning, nothing rich. Esther bowed her head, hiding the flicker of thought that sparked in her eyes. A plain dish, untouched by the lavish seasonings of the others, would be noticed if it carried trouble. Yet it could also serve as the perfect distraction, a body struck down early, turning all suspicion toward illness, not design. She agreed softly, and when the mistress left, she pressed her lips tight to keep from smiling. She began to prepare the younger helpers with small lessons. Do not taste too much, she told them. Keep your hands clean. Follow her steps closely and ask no questions. They obeyed without thought, too busy with their own fear of mistakes to notice the deeper current running through her voice. Only Ida looked at her with searching eyes, as though she sensed something unspoken, but Esther said nothing. Words could be dangerous if carried by the wrong ears. In the late hours, when even the harbor had fallen quiet, she sat alone by the stove, grinding herbs with steady hands. She imagined the hall lit with candles, the guests in fine clothes, their laughter rising like smoke. She imagined the hush that would follow when the first signs appeared, the confusion, the fear spreading like fire through the crowd. She imagined Thornhill's face paling, his body failing, the power stripped from him in a moment he could not control. The thought filled her with a calm she had not known in years. She began to move differently, slower in her steps, letting her joints seem stiff, her shoulders bent. If anyone noticed, they would think age weighed her down. In truth, her mind was sharper than ever, her body steady, her resolve clear. She carried the powder in small packets tucked into her apron, hidden in plain sight, as she worked through the endless preparations. Each day Ida sank deeper into sorrow, her eyes hollow from the loss of Lucy. Esther watched her with quiet grief, knowing the girl had little left to hold on to. At night, when the others slept, Esther whispered to her of Samuel, the free man who knew the marsh paths. She told her that one day, soon she would walk with him, far from this house, far from Thornhill's reach. Ida listened without trust, but Esther pressed a silver spoon into her hand, told her to keep it hidden, told her it would be proof of who she belonged to when she reached the ones who would help her. The girl wept silently, clutching the spoon as though it were the last piece of her sister she could still hold. The days shortened, the air sharp with cold, and the mansion filled with more noise, more demands. Thornhill's voice boomed, Caroline's commands cut, Parsons' whip cracked in the yard. Through it all, Esther moved like a shadow, her face calm, her hands steady, the secret powder resting close. The plan grew clearer with each step, not a dream now, but a recipe set firm in her mind. She told herself she would wait, that she would time it with the precision of a feast, each moment measured, each dish prepared just so. And when the night of the ball arrived, the house would not know what hand had shaped its fate until it was too late. Winter settled over Charleston with a brittle edge, the harbor winds cutting through narrow streets lined with flickering lamps. Inside Thornhill Mansion, warmth and noise filled every corner, but in the kitchen the air was heavier, carrying with it the weight of what was coming. Esther felt the hours ticking like a clock, each moment drawing her closer to the night she had prepared for nearly her whole life without knowing it. She carried her calm like a mask, moving through her duties as though nothing had shifted, though everything inside her had changed. The house swelled with anticipation. Boxes of candles arrived from the city, Pine garlands wound up stair rails, silver polished until it shone like ice. Caroline prowled the halls with sharp eyes, correcting servants for smudges invisible to anyone else, her shrill voice grating through the walls. Thornhill drank deeper each day, the weight of his debts hidden behind his swagger, his laughter too loud, his hands slapping the backs of men he would later curse in private. The overseer Parsons walked the grounds, whip in hand, eyes searching for any excuse to strike. Esther moved among them like smoke, present yet unnoticed. She bent over bowls, stirring sauces with a steady hand, tested gravies with her tongue, adjusted flavors as only she could. To the household, she was nothing but the cook, valuable yet invisible, the one who turned raw goods into luxury, who made Thornhill's parties the envy of Charleston. None saw how she measured time, not by the sun, but by the nearness of Christmas night. In her room, beneath the thin blanket and straw mattress, the packet of powder waited in its tin. She touched it nightly, her hand steady, her mind rehearsing the plan. She had divided the doses, small for some, deadly for others. She had studied the menu until it lived inside her head, each dish a stage upon which fate would play. She knew where each twist of paper would be hidden, how each would be slipped unseen into food or drink. She had no doubts left, only patience. Ida remained quiet, her grief a shadow that clung to her. The girl moved through chores with hollow eyes, her small hands scrubbing, carrying, polishing without life. Esther guided her gently, shielding her from Parsons when she could, giving her easier tasks in the kitchen rather than exposing her to the mistress's temper. At night, when Ida's tears returned, Esther whispered softly of a way out. She told her of Samuel, of the marsh path, of a man named Julius who helped the lost move north. She pressed hope into the girl's hands the way she pressed dough, firm and steady, shaping it until it held. Samuel agreed to guide Ida on the night of the ball, when the house would be too distracted to notice one girl slipping away. Esther gave him a spoon of silver and a bundle of food, small treasures that could mean survival. She did not tell Ida everything. She kept the darkest part of her plan hidden. The girl would not carry that weight. It was hers alone, and she would see it through. The nights before the ball grew restless. Jeremiah's grave still felt fresh in the earth, his absence haunting her like a whisper in the wind. She thought of his hands, scarred and steady, of the way he had been a piece of her past that the Thornhills had not been able to strip away. His death burned inside her, fusing with the memory of her children, with Lucy's sale, with every wound Thornhill and his family had inflicted. They thought her powerless, a shadow in their house, but she had become something far stronger. She began to feign weariness in her work, letting her steps drag, her hands shake lightly as if age had caught her. Caroline scolded her, warning her not to fail before the ball, and Esther lowered her eyes, murmuring agreement. To the mistress it seemed weakness. To Esther it was the perfect disguise. She let them believe she was breaking under the weight of her years, while inside she held a resolve as sharp as a knife. The final days became a rehearsal. She oversaw the kitchen as dishes were tested, adjusted, perfected. She prepared the punch base, thick with fruit and spice, knowing it would mask anything bitter. Thornhill praised it, demanding it be made stronger, and she smiled without warmth, imagining the last taste he would ever know. She refined her measures, tested the powder again on stray creatures, watching closely, memorizing the timing of sickness, the slide from pain to stillness. The house brimmed with chatter about the guest list. Governor Johnson, Judge Preston, the Whitehams, the Sinclairs, all names that carried weight in Charleston, all names that had sat in judgment over people like her. Esther listened without comment, hiding her thoughts behind the steady rhythm of her work. Each name became another face she would see across the table, another soul who would swallow her food without knowing its cost. On Christmas Eve morning, the air was cold and sharp. Frost rimed the windows of the kitchen, though the fires burned hot. Esther stood before her pots, her apron tied, her hands calm. She had reached the end of her waiting. The ball was only hours away, and the time of silence was nearly over. Every dish she would make, every tray she would send out, would carry more than food. It would carry her years of grief, her fury, her justice. She breathed deeply, the scent of spice filling her lungs, and felt a steadiness settle over her. The countdown had ended. The night she had prepared for was here. The night came draped in frost, the air so sharp it cut at the skin of anyone stepping from carriage to door. Yet inside Thornhill Mansion, the world bloomed in fire and music. Lanterns glowed along the drive, casting golden circles on the gravel, while the sound of violins drifted from the wide open windows. Guests arrived in silks and furs, laughter spilling ahead of them, their boots leaving streaks of mud on the steps that servants hurried to wipe clean before the next carriage rolled up. Esther worked in the kitchen, the heart of the feast, the place no guest would ever notice, though it gave life to every glittering moment upstairs. Flames roared in the hearth, the air thick with the scent of roasting goose and sweet puddings, oysters simmering in cream, and spices sharp enough to mask the bitter trace of powder hidden deep in the dishes. Her hands moved steady, her eyes watchful, guiding the younger ones through the chaos. Ida darted beside her, fetching, carrying, silent as a shadow, her fear heavy but her steps obedient. Above them, music swelled. The first sets had begun, ladies' skirts sweeping wide across the polished floor, gentlemen bowing, heels clicking sharp against the wood. Caroline glided among them like a queen, her gown glittering, her hair set in perfect curls. Thornhill strutted through the crowd, his laughter loud, his face flushed already with wine. Parsons lingered near the servants who moved between guests, his whip absent, but his presence still a threat. Trays rose from the kitchen, one after another, carried by trembling hands. Platters of beef tongues soaked in Madeira sauce, roasted goose browned to perfection, puddings dusted with sugar, and bowls of spiced punch heavy with rum. Esther oversaw each tray, her eyes sharp, ensuring no hand strayed, no bite was stolen. She knew exactly which dishes carried her touch, which bowls shimmered with more than spice. Each one passed through her hands before climbing the stairs into the blaze of candlelight. The first signs were slow, almost invisible beneath the crush of music and chatter. A guest dabbed at his lips, pale under the glow of candles. Another set down her fork, pressing a hand to her stomach with a polite smile that masked the edge of discomfort. Esther's ears caught the shift even before the servants whispered back down the stairs. She stirred a pot with perfect calm, though inside her chest her heart beat heavy. The punch bowl emptied fast, glasses filled again and again. Thornhill drank with gusto, his booming laugh shaking the chandeliers. He toasted to fortune, to Charleston's pride, to the loyalty of his friends. The governor raised his glass, the judges clinked theirs. Caroline beamed as though her house had become the center of the world. Esther imagined them swallowing their pride along with the sweet burn, the powder slipping into their blood with every sip. By the second course, whispers had begun. A man excused himself from the floor, sweat shining at his temple despite the cold. A woman coughed sharply into her handkerchief, her smile slipping. Esther's helpers returned with wide eyes, describing the shifts they saw. The governor's hand trembling, the judge's face paling, the mistress fanning herself though the hall was cool. Esther only nodded, instructing them to carry more trays, her voice even as stone. Ida caught her eye once, fear flickering in her face, but Esther gave her no sign, no word, only the steady calm of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. The girl turned back to her work, clutching the hidden spoon in her pocket, waiting for the moment Samuel would come. Upstairs, the music faltered as another guest staggered. A hush swept across the hall, quickly broken by nervous laughter, then the sound of Caroline's sharp voice commanding servants to bring water, to open windows. Thornhill cursed at the sight of weakness among his guests, demanding more wine to cover the moment, his pride too swollen to sense what crept through the room. Esther heard it all in the rhythm of boots on the stairs, the rush of orders carried down, the unease thickening with each plate returned half-eaten. The kitchen itself remained a storm of motion, but Esther stood at its center untouched, stirring, slicing, plating, her mind fixed on the tide she had unleashed. She felt no joy, no gloating. What filled her instead was a deep stillness, as if the years of pain, the chains of grief, had been distilled into this one night. Jeremiah's blood, Lucy's cries, her children torn from her, all of it lived in the dishes now carried through that golden hall. The ball pressed on, though the laughter grew thin, the dancing uneven. Faces turned pale, smiles cracked, hands trembled against glass. Yet still Thornhill drank, still Caroline strutted, still Parsons hovered with suspicion in his eyes, though he could not name the shadow that hung over them. Esther continued her work without falter, the mask of a loyal cook fixed firm, while above her the house of Thornhill began to sway under the weight of its own feast. The night was far from finished. The first cracks had appeared, but the storm had only begun to rise. The hall, once so full of glitter and sound, began to twist into something else. Candlelight no longer seemed warm but sharp, throwing long shadows across the walls as the music faltered, the bow of the violin slipping under a trembling hand. The air grew thick with perfume and sweat, mixed with the sour edge of fear. Esther could hear it even from the kitchen, the sudden breaks in laughter, the coughing swallowed behind napkins, the scrape of chairs pushed back too fast. Word came in fragments carried down by nervous servants. The governor had turned pale, his hands unsteady on the arms of his chair. Judge Preston bent over, gripping his stomach as though gripped by a sudden cramp. Miss Sinclair, already known for weakness, was slumped faintly in her seat, her fan fallen to the floor. Guests whispered illness, bad oysters, the heavy spice of the punch. They did not yet see the pattern, but Esther did. Every detail unfolded exactly as she had measured it, the rhythm of their decline moving with the precision of a clock she alone had wound. Thornhill barked for more wine, furious at the weakness of his guests. His face flushed, his voice boomed, but his swagger wavered. The sweat on his brow did not come only from drink. He raised his glass again and again, swearing nothing was wrong in his house, that no sickness could mar his feast. Caroline moved through the crowd, her smile cracking as she tried to steady the unraveling. Her silks brushed against men too weak to rise, her hands pressed on shoulders that sagged beneath her. She hissed commands at the servants, demanding broth, water, cool air. None of it slowed the tide. Parsons watched with sharp eyes, suspicion tightening his jaw. He saw weakness as danger, not mystery, and his gaze cut toward the servants. He shoved one boy aside, cursed another for moving too slow. His steps grew heavier as though he too felt the creeping sickness, but still he pushed through the crowd, eyes narrowing when they fell toward the stair leading to the kitchen. Esther knew he would come. She had prepared for that moment too. The kitchen trembled with tension. The younger ones whispered in fear, begging Esther to tell them what was happening. She silenced them with a glance, her calm unshaken. She kept them working, filling trays with bread and water, sending them upward into the chaos. Ida stayed close, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides. She looked at Esther as though searching for an answer, a reason, but Esther gave her nothing more than the quiet steadiness of her presence. Some truths could not be spoken, they had to be lived. The sounds from above grew harsher, moans, gasps, the clatter of a glass striking the floor. Someone retched, the sound carrying through the polished hall and down the stairwell. The music had stopped entirely. Esther pictured the grand room as she stirred the last pot. Its guests sprawled across chairs, some collapsed to the floor, their fine clothes stained with sweat and sickness. She imagined Thornhill gripping the edge of the table, his pride crumbling as his strength failed, the master of the house undone by the hands he had never seen as worthy of meeting his eye. Parsons burst through the kitchen door, his face pale, his breath ragged. His voice cracked as he demanded to know what had been served, what Esther had done. She met his fury with calm, telling him only that the dishes were what had been ordered, nothing more, nothing less. He shoved past her, searching the pots, tearing open cupboards, as though answers lay hidden in plain sight. His hands trembled, his words slurred. Esther knew the poison already moved in him, his rage no defense against what flowed in his veins. He staggered, cursed, and stormed back toward the stairs, leaving behind the stench of fear that clung to him stronger than the rum on his breath. Ida clutched Esther's arm, whispering that they would be found out, that Thornhill would kill them all. Esther knelt to the girl's height, her eyes steady, her voice low. She told her to wait, to trust, to be ready when Samuel came. She pressed the girl's hand around the hidden spoon again, closing her fingers tight, telling her to hold it like a key. Ida nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks, but her breath steadied under Esther's gaze. The noise from above turned into chaos. Shouts, groans, the sound of feet rushing, of chairs crashing. Esther sent the younger ones out of the kitchen, telling them to stay low, to keep clear of the hall. She alone remained by the fire, her hands folding calmly before her, her face still. She had no fear now. The house that had lived on her labor, her pain, her silence, was unraveling above her. Every stone of it seemed to tremble with the weight of what had been set in motion. Thornhill's voice boomed once more, but it was cracked, ragged, forced against the weakness that dragged at him. Caroline screamed his name, her cry carrying down the stairs, sharp and thin as glass. Parsons shouted orders, his words stumbling, his steps heavy. The grand house of Thornhill, filled with Charleston's finest, had become a place of moans and terror. Esther stood in the center of the kitchen, the firelight flickering against her face, her breath even. She did not smile, did not gloat. She simply watched the shadows dance on the walls and listened to the sound of poison moving through the veins of her master and his kind. The night had reached its turning. What began in silence now roared through the mansion, and nothing would return to what it had been before. The mansion groaned like a body in pain. Every polished wall, every shining floor, seemed to echo with the cries of those who had filled it with laughter only hours before. Servants ran wild through the halls, carrying bowls of water, cloths dipped in vinegar, whatever scraps of comfort they could find. The guests of Charleston, those who strutted in silks and spoke with voices sharp as blades, now lay scattered across chairs and floors, their jewels askew, their fine clothes damp with sweat. The music was gone, the dancing silenced, replaced by the sound of sickness rising from every corner of the grand room. Thornhill slumped in his great chair at the head of the table, his once booming voice reduced to hoarse growls, his chest heaving as he tried to steady himself. His glass lay shattered at his feet, red wine pooling like blood on the polished floor. Caroline knelt beside him, her curls undone, her face streaked with tears as she begged him to hold on. She shouted for the servants to bring water, for a doctor, for anything that might save her world from collapse. Yet no hand could stop what was already flowing through his veins. The overseer Parsons, once so sure in his cruelty, staggered like a man beaten, his skin gray, his eyes wild with fear. He leaned on the wall for support, his curses breaking into groans. Esther remained in the kitchen, standing by the fire that still burned steady, her apron neat, her hands folded. The noise from above came to her as though through a veil, each sound confirming what she already knew. Her work was finished. She had prepared the feast, measured each portion, guided it from her pots to their mouths. The rest was no longer in her hands. Justice, once denied her for so many years, now walked the halls of the mansion in the bodies of the masters themselves. Ida trembled beside her, whispering questions Esther did not answer. The girl wanted to know if they would be punished, if Thornhill would rise again, if the house would burn with their names on its lips. Esther touched her hand, firm and steady, and told her only that Samuel would come, that she must be ready. She spoke no more than that, for she knew fear needed no fuel. Instead, she kept her voice even, her face calm, until the girl's breathing matched hers. Outside, the carriages waited empty, their drivers whispering nervously in the cold. They heard the shouts but dared not enter, their masters trapped inside, their fates sealed by food and drink. Some muttered prayers, others crossed themselves, for they knew sickness could strike quick and cruel, and none wished to carry it home. Midnight passed. The candles upstairs guttered low, wax dripping onto tablecloths stained with spilled punch and grease. Guests who still clung to strength begged to be carried out, but their legs betrayed them. Those who had laughed the loudest now cried out in fear, their voices rising in broken hymns and half-remembered prayers. Caroline's cries grew hoarse, her fine dress ruined by the sweat and blood of those she tried to steady. Thornhill's hand clutched hers, his grip weak, his eyes clouded, rage and fear twisting together as his breath shortened. Parsons collapsed in the corner of the hall, no whip in his hand now, only his trembling body racked with sickness. His curses faded into silence, his chest rising slower with each moment. The man who had walked the yard like a storm lay powerless, undone by what he could not strike down. Esther rose from her stool at last. She moved through the kitchen one final time, touching the pots, the knives, the hearth that had been both her prison and her kingdom. Every meal she had made, every dish carried above, had been a piece of her life stolen from her and handed to those who believed themselves her masters. Tonight she had taken it back, not with fire or blade, but with the same hands they had forced to serve. Samuel came quietly, slipping through the back door as planned. His eyes found Esther, then Ida, and without words he knew it was time. Esther pressed the girl forward, placing her into his care, the silver spoon hidden in her pocket, the proof of trust she would need. Ida clung to her for a moment, tears wetting Esther's apron, but Samuel pulled her gently away. Esther whispered that she must go now, that she must walk into the night and never look back. The girl nodded, though her sobs shook her small frame, and then she was gone into the dark, her figure swallowed by the cold air. Esther did not follow. She returned to the fire, her body steady, her eyes calm. The house still echoed with cries, but she no longer listened. Her work was done. Whatever came next, whether Thornhill died before dawn, whether Caroline rose in rage, whether Charleston whispered of poisoned feasts, none of it mattered more than the fact that she had acted. For once, she had not bowed her head, had not swallowed her grief. She had turned it into something sharp, something that cut through chains and silks alike. The night waned. Soon the city would know what had happened, rumors spreading like wind through narrow streets, whispers of a grand ball undone by sickness, of powerful men brought low in a single evening. Some would speak of spoiled food, others of curses, still others of vengeance too terrible to name. The truth would be buried, as truth often was, but Esther carried it in her chest, a fire that would not fade. She sat alone in the kitchen, the embers glowing low, her hands folded in her lap. Around her the mansion groaned under the weight of its ruin, but she remained still. The reckoning had come, not with armies, not with fire, but with the quiet hand of a cook who had lived too long in silence. And though her name would never be spoken in the halls of Charleston, she knew the night belonged to her.